Hello, everyone. Welcome to 𝗂𝗏𝘁 Spotlight, a special series. I'm Brian Choi, Managing Partner and CEO of the Food Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're tuning in, please make sure to send in your comments and questions. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button across our social media channels on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Your support means a lot. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with an investor, environmentalist, and best-selling author, Charles Conn. He has a new book called The Imperfectionist Strategic Mindsets for Uncertain Times. Charles, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Great. So, Charles, you have a very interesting background. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your past and what you're doing presently.
Right. As you said, I'm an investor. I work in venture capital space, looking mostly at life sciences companies. I also work on the Patagonia Board, the international clothing company that also does food nowadays. We have Patagonia Provisions. I operate in the world of ideas. So as you mentioned, I've written a new book about how to do strategic problem solving under high uncertainty.
Great. And you also have a past being a partner at McKinsey as well. So you've advised many companies, large and small, in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I spent quite a while at McKinsey, and in the years after that, also worked a lot in both investing in companies and advising companies. And the research that this book is based on is 10 years in the making and 50 all new case studies that my co-author 𝗟𝗏𝘁 and I developed.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, let's delve straight into the book. I've had a chance to review it, and I have to say, from the outset that it definitely challenged my way of thinking, leading a media company. And I agree with a lot of the conclusions that you come up with, with the book. So maybe share with us a little bit about why you wrote this book and why you think it's necessary in this time.
Yeah, so what we were seeing in our previous book, which was called Bulletproof Problem Solving, was about the techniques for doing strategic problem solving. But what we noticed as Rob and I were looking from the vantage point of the pandemic was just how paralyzed many companies are, companies and nonprofits. Um, we've had over the course of the last 50 years faster and faster change, but that's accelerated to a pretty extreme degree over the last 10 or 20 years. We have increasing impact from artificial intelligence, including agents like ChatGPT and the large language models that follow it, computational biology, robotics, and other kinds of automation, really starting to change the shape of employment, and I think change the strategic playing field for many companies. Most of us grew up in a world in which things were relatively stable, and especially around industry structure. So all the strategy work that we grew up with assumes that there are firm industry boundaries and that the change is within boundaries that people can understand. None of that's true anymore. In fact, you're more likely to be disrupted by a player from outside your industry than from inside, and often from a group of super competitors. Think of Apple or Amazon or Google or Microsoft, who previously didn't even operate in your space. And that's changed the whole strategic framework for folks and has caused, I think, two things. One is the pathology of paralysis. We'll just wait till things stabilize and then we'll do something smart. Or the pathology of leaping before you look. And so, you might look at, say, the acquisition of Twitter as one of those kinds of moves. People are looking both frozen and desperate, and neither one of those things makes sense.
Well, let's bring up that graphic where it talks about the six different mindsets, what it means to be an imperfectionist. So, Charles, can you go through each one of those pillars and maybe provide an example of what they
Sure.
mean?
Yeah, sure. So what we suggest to folks is that in the face of this very fast changing environment that I just described, that rather than be paralyzed, that they actually step into risk, but they do that in an intelligent way. We call that being imperfectionist, and I'll come back around and summarize with that at the end. What that means is really being an experimentalist. And so experimentation starts with curiosity. And I know this seems like a very rudimentary place to start, but it amazes me how, especially the most successful companies, lose their curiosity. They don't think openly about the world that they're competing in. They think about it just through their own frame. I think another example, since we're talking about food, another great example is Nespresso. So Nespresso was the invention of an engineer, it's actually a rocket scientist called 𝗟𝗏𝘂𝗃, who was working for Nespresso. And he was in Rome with his wife, and he noticed, he was out for coffee in the morning, and he noticed that one coffee shop had a huge queue out the door, and none of the other coffee shops did. And he wondered, what's going on in there? And his curiosity sparked him to go inside and to see the old barista who was in there working, the espresso machine, putting in huge amounts of extra pressure. His name was Eugenio, and he thought that his machine was broken. So he kept pumping the handle each time, putting 20 bars of pressure into the coffee, which created this thick crema on the top. And when Fev left, he thought, I wonder if there's a way to recreate that from a Nestle perspective. That curiosity is what led to Nespresso. And he went home and he created this huge apparatus to see if he could mimic what Eugenio was doing at St. Eustachio's coffee shop. Those are two examples of how, if we see things through the fresh eyes of curiosity, we often see them in a different way, even when things are changing quickly.
Why is it that, as companies get larger, why do they lose that curiosity? Is that something ingrained in human nature that the older we get or the more mature we get, we want less risk? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think you can view curiosity when kids are young, that when they ask 300 questions a day, that's literally the number, 200 or 300 questions a day when people are in there from age 3 to age 5, for example. And then as we learn about the world and we develop little patterns for what works, for example, when you're tying your shoes, the first few times you do it, you probably try a bunch of different ways. And then when eventually someone tells you how to tie a bow, a double bow, and to put a knot in the top of that, that's what you settle in on. And I think almost everything we encounter in the world, as we get older, we begin to impose a pattern on it that's worked for us in the past. Problem is when our pattern recognition engine isn't right. And when things are changing quickly, your pattern recognition engine is often not right? And companies are exactly the same. Bigger the company, the more successful the company, the more likely it is that it has a success pattern locked in that isn't really the right one anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, being raised in an Asian American household where my parents told me to be perfect in everything from math to science to music. And, a lot of those mindsets, those ingrained behaviors, it's easy to kind of fall into that trap. And, for me, having taken over the Food Institute, which is almost a 100-year-old company, and having to transform it in the middle of COVID, all of the learnings that I've learned, in the past is really kind of, I had to throw that out the window because like you said, Charles, we're in a new season of risk and of accelerated change. So completely agree with you there. Let's see one of the other buckets, the dragonfly.
This second mindset that we think is important to the kind of environment we're in now encourages you to see things through multiple perspectives rather than just the perspective that's worked for you in the past. We use the analogy of a dragonfly because dragonflies have these two large compound eyes. Everyone's familiar with what those look like. And they have more than 3,000 lenses, and actually 3 different types of lenses. That allows a dragonfly to see almost 360 degrees and to see a range of colors and motions that are way beyond human spectrum. We love that as an analogy, which we borrowed from the famous forecasting author Philip Tetlock, as another key mindset as you approach decision-making under high uncertainty. Stop before you begin crafting your strategy and imagine, for example, what your company and its products look like from the perspective of customers or prospective customers or suppliers or near substitutes or competitors or potential competitors. And if you begin to see, we call it an environmental perspective, to see your company from those multiple perspectives, you may well get insights about your strategy that you wouldn't get if you only looked at it through the lens that you always look at it.
The third mindset here is a current behavior. Now, that's a term that we don't normally hear on a day-to-day basis. So share with us what that means.
Yeah, it's a funny term, isn't it? We kind of like it. What it means is what actually happened rather than what you think is going to happen. And for us, this mindset is about collecting new data. All of us who worked in consulting and investment banking know what it's like to go to the existing databases as soon as you get an assignment. The problem with all the existing data that's already been collected is everybody else has it too. And usually you pay for access to it. And you're then riffing your strategy off the same data that everyone else is. What we encourage people to do is to collect their own data. People are very used to this being something that internet companies do because, you can put up interface A, interface B, and interface C, and which one gets more traffic and less drop off. So I think folks are already open to the idea that experimentation is important. But many people think that that only pertains to the kind of asset light businesses that you have in the internet. Isn't true.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. It's something that we do here at the Food Institute. In addition to getting all the traditional industry data from IRI, from Nielsen, we collect our own data as well. And that's been a huge growth strategy for us over the past couple of years. The next one, collective intelligence. Now, we're normally taught that you want the smartest people, in the room. That's what I was taught. That's what I learned in business school. But now you're telling that in this new sort of season that you want other people in the room that might not be, quote, the smartest. So talk to us a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thought is always, and, you worked in investment banks where, everyone thought they were the smartest person in the room, no doubt. Right. And we always want to have the smartest people inside our company. But, Bill Joy, who was one of the founders of Sun Microsystems, who's famous for Joy's Law, said, hey, the smartest people probably are working for somebody else. And then he asked this really interesting question, which is, how can you get them laboring in your garden too? An example I love, which we'll call it food adjacent, is a project called 𝗏𝗏, which was done by the Nature Conservancy. They don't have a bunch of AI experts inside the Nature Conservancy. They knew they wanted to protect endangered fish species. And they could convince fishing companies to put cameras on boats, video cameras on tuna fishing boats offshore. But how could you use those cameras to identify quickly fish that were endangered and should be carefully put over the side, and which fish were okay to catch? And you can see from this image, what a computer vision competition did on Kaggle with a $150,000 prize was to generate more than 3,000 entries from folks who used algorithms looking at the shape of gill plates and the shape of fins to quickly predict whether an endangered tuna had been caught or one that you could keep had been caught. And that's now being trialed in the fishing fleet off of Indonesia and probably roll out worldwide. Nature Conservancy didn't have those capabilities in-house, but it was able to access those for a relatively low price. So imagine if every company allocated part of its R&D budget not to more R&D by their own engineers, but to accessing incredibly brilliant R&D by people outside, especially people who are not already warped by their too many years looking at the same problem.
Yeah. And so another question for you, Charles, is so if there's a food manufacturer out there, right, that's maybe, been in business for the past 20 years, what does this collective mindset look like? Does it mean you're going out to other consultants or what does that look like in that sort of scenario?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it could be as simple as that, which is, accessing consultants from outside the industry. Remember that the consultants from inside the industry are likely to have the same existing mindsets that you have. And they're probably going to tell you what you want to hear, and that's probably not what you should hear.
Right.
When you and I were talking in advance, one of the things that really occurs to me is how to take advantage of big data and artificial intelligence. And a lot of times people in industries like food assume that that's something that occurs, in rocket travel, but not in food. And I think that's wrong. I think food manufacturers should also be thinking about how can I use big data sets and learning models in order to come up with new perspectives on food, whether that's food engineering. And as you know, there's a whole new movement around synthetic or manufactured meat, for example. And a lot of that has to do with people using artificial intelligence to rethink how protein gets produced. But it could also be using big data to think of other new techniques for combining foods, or for creating longer shelf life in foods, or for using types of food ingredients that people don't do today. I think even in an industry like food, where people tend to think things haven't changed very much, the application of these technologies can be utterly transformational.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. The next one, show and tell. So
Yeah.
I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but maybe share with us what that means for you and how it applies to companies today.
Yeah, so show and tell, that it's that thing that kids do in kindergarten, right? Where you bring in something from home and you tell a story about it. What we wanted to spark in people's minds as they think about making their strategies in this highly uncertain time is, once you begin to have an idea about what the strategy should be, how do you bring other people on board? Typically, we use boring PowerPoints, and PowerPoint's great. Everyone uses it. If it didn't exist, you'd invent it. But in the world where people decreasingly believe other people, to convince people to follow your lead, to follow your new strategy, even if you're the CEO of something, requires doing something beyond PowerPoint. And we love this idea of storytelling, especially visual storytelling. And so one example that we use in the book is an example drawn also from the Nature Conservancy, where they invited a group of philanthropic donors into the room. And in the back of the room, there were 17 brand new green plastic buckets. And all the philanthropists from the foundation looked at the buckets and said, "What are those?" It immediately became a center of people's interest. And as soon as they sat down, the presenter said, "What those are 10-liter buckets." And what we're here to talk about is the impact of shellfish reefs, and particularly oyster reefs, in terms of cleaning the water in estuaries. And what they were looking for was funding to create new shellfish reefs in coastal Australia. And what they explain then, using, again, the prop of these buckets, is that every single oyster filters 17 buckets worth, so 170 liters a day of water that's often contaminated coming out of estuaries. So rather than putting up a graphic or some kind of a table of information about oysters and filtering, they use this visual approach to really grab people's attention. This idea is, how can you speak to people's values and passions, not just to the stuff between their ears, when you want to convince them to do strategies which are outside the norm?
Right. I love that. So applicable for today.
Yeah.
So we talked about 6 different mindsets: being an imperfectionist, ever curious, dragonfly eye, a current behavior, collective intelligence, show and tell. Charles Conn, thank you so much for coming on our program. I think your book is fantastic, and I think every leader out there should definitely buy the book. Charles, where can our audience members find out more about the book, and where can they buy it?
Sure. So you can go to theimperfectionists.org, or you can go to 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝑙𝒡proofproblemsolving.com, or you can find it at Amazon or any other bookseller. And Brian, it was a real pleasure to be on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Charles. And a special thanks to our viewers for joining us today. Don't forget, you can find more podcast episodes, our weekly newscast, FI Live replays, and even subscribe to our newsletters right on our website at www.foodinstitute.com. I'm Brian Choi, CEO of the Food Institute, and I'll see you again next time. Thank you.